My name is Piotr Skowron and I work at the University of Warsaw. In my research I study election rules, and in this talk I'm going to speak about participatory budgeting. That is a process which allows citizens, through voting, to decide how to spend a part of the municipal budget. In the first step of participatory budgeting, projects can be proposed. In order to propose a project, one needs to estimate its cost and prepare its description. In the second step, the citizens, through voting, express their opinions about the submitted projects. Their votes are counted, and based on them, a final decision is made which of those submitted projects shall receive funding. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the second step, on elections. I will discuss two election rules that apply to the setting of participatory budgeting, and I will explain how important is the choice of the right rule in terms of how efficiently we spend public money and how fairly we treat citizens in the process of voting. Let's first discuss types of ballots, that is, the ways in which the voters can express their preferences over the submitted projects. Perhaps the simplest ballot type is approval voting, where the voters simply choose which projects they support. Here we can see an example voting card for approval voting, where 7 projects have been proposed, and the voter decided to support 3 of them: building a new bike path, renovation of playground, and building a new outdoor gym. An alternative to approval voting is voting in scale, where the voters additionally express how strongly they support the particular projects. In this example, a voter was asked to assign between 0 to 10 points to each project, and we can see that she assigned 9 points to the playground, which means that this project has strong support from this voter. She assigned 4 points to building a new bike path, which means that this project is not as important as playground, but still has strong support from this voter. And she assigned 1 point to the outdoor gym, which means that perhaps this voter would be interested in using this project once founded, but out of those 3, it has the lowest priority. One thing is a ballot type, and a completely different thing is what we then do with the ballots collected from the voters. A rule which specifies how the ballots are counted and how we make final decision based on those votes is called an election rule. In my opinion, the choice between ballot types is not critical. Both approval voting and voting in scale have their own advantages and disadvantages, and the choice between these two boils down to whether simplicity or having more accurate information from the voters is our primary goal. And indeed, approval voting is very simple. The voters only choose which projects they support. Voting in scale requires more effort from the voters, but at the same time gives us more accurate information regarding their preferences. However, as I said, each of these two ballot types is good. The situation is completely different with election rules. Choosing wrong election rule might have severe consequences with respect to efficiency of spending public money and treating the voters equally. In the remaining part of this talk, I'm going to focus on election rules. Let me first explain the greedy rule, which is the rule used by most cities that use participatory budgeting. The greedy rule is very simple. If the voters vote via approvals, then for each project we count the total number of votes cast for this project, and we pick those projects which receive the highest number of votes until the budget is exhausted. If the voters vote in scale, the rule is defined analogously. For each project, we count the total number of points assigned to this project by the voters, and we pick those projects which receive the highest number of points until the budget is exhausted. This rule is simple, but it is a bad rule. I will now explain the problems with the greedy rule based on simple illustrative examples, and then based on data coming from real elections carried out in major Polish cities. In the next part of the talk, I will explain an alternative, a method which in the literature is called method of equal shares, which doesn't have the problems that appear in the greedy rule. So let's start with the greedy rule and consider the following simple example. In this city, a number of projects have been proposed, and these projects can be divided into 3 categories. The first category consists of projects that relate to building new infrastructure for bikes. The second category is about organizing new green areas. And the third category consists of projects that relate to building new playgrounds. The city has 4 districts, roughly equal size. However, one of these districts is slightly larger than the remaining 3 ones. Now imagine that the voters voted exactly on the projects from their districts. What would happen if we use the greedy rule to select the winning projects? Observe that the projects from the most populous area would receive the highest number of votes. Indeed, each such a project would receive 110,000 votes. Since the greedy rule selects the projects by the number of votes, the projects from the most populous district would be selected. And only such projects. This would be highly unfair since the votes of roughly 75% of the city would be ignored. Such citizens would have absolutely no influence on how the public money is spent. This is unacceptable, and this problem is not only theoretical. It has been identified by cities, and the cities try to deal with this problem. The most commonly applied solution is to divide the budget a priori between the districts and to run an independent election in each district separately. However, this only seemingly solves the problem. The rule still treats the voters unequally, which I will explain later on. And what is worse, this solution causes new types of problems that pertain to efficiency in spending public money. Before I will explain these issues, however, observe that if we divide the budget a priori between the districts, then even the voters do not have possibility to fully express their preferences according to their will. For example, imagine parents who would like to build a new playground in the city center. The parents know that they would be willing to use this playground if built, however have no possibility to express this opinion in their preferences since they are forced to vote only on the projects from their district. Similarly, cyclists who would like to build a new part of the bike path, they have no possibility to vote for such part if this part is not in their district. As another example, consider citizens who live close to the borders. They cannot vote for the projects in their neighborhood only because those projects formally are submitted in a different district. And again, this is not only a theoretical problem. We observe that also in data. For example, in Gdańsk in 2020, the voters were allowed to vote for projects not only from their own district. We observed that over 15% of people voted for projects from multiple districts. This is not surprising. We live in one part of the city, we work in another one, our children go to school in yet another part of the city. Thus, we might be interested in projects from multiple parts of the city. This confirms that putting constraints on the voters and forcing them to vote only for projects from their own district might in some cases cause them not to vote according to their true preferences. Yet this is not the biggest problem. A much more important issue is what I mentioned before, that the division of the budget a priori causes public money being spent inefficiently. Why this is the case? Consider a district where only very unpopular projects have been submitted. That is, only such projects that received very low support from the voters. Still, the district needs to use the money that it was assigned and select some of those unpopular projects. Have a look what happened in Krakow in 2021. There, a part of the municipal budget was was assigned to district projects, and a part of the municipal budget was also designated to what we call citywide projects. That is, projects which are potentially interesting to voters from multiple districts. One such citywide project was about building green areas in Prądnik, the district of Prądnik, and this project received a relatively high support of over 3,000 votes, and over 2,000 of those votes were cast by voters who live in the district of Prądnik. This project cost 300,000 Polish zlotys. It did not receive funding because there was not enough room in the pool designated for these citywide projects. At the same time, a very similar project, also about green areas in the district of Prądnik, received much lower support. It received 1,300 votes and was more expensive. It cost 550,000 Polish zlotys, and it received funding only because it was submitted in the district of Prądnik, where the competition was much lower than among the citywide projects. So we see that a project which was much less popular and which was more expensive was selected at the cost of the project which received higher support from the voters and which was even cheaper. A similar situation happened in Warsaw in 2021. There we had two projects, also quite similar because they both concerned the street of Modlińska. One of these projects was citywide and it received quite high support of over 12,000 votes. Over 4,000 of those votes were cast by the citizens of Białowieża. It cost 435,000 Polish zlotys. It did not receive funding. But at the same time, there was a similar project submitted in the district of Białowieża, which received 6 times fewer votes, which was more expensive, and it was selected. Another example is from Warsaw from 2020. Here I have shown only 3 examples, but there are hundreds of them. Actually, in every dataset that we looked at, we were able to find such examples that prove inefficiency of the division of the budget a priori. So the division of the budget a priori is inefficient. However, as I mentioned before, it also does not solve the problem of fairness. Still, the voters are treated unequally. Why this is the case? So the division of the budget a priori is fair only with respect to different districts. However, the voters differ not only with respect to the place where they live, but what is more important, with respect to their interests. Let's move back once again to our illustrative example. Now assume that there are no districts, or that we run an election within a single district. Assume that 30% of voters voted for projects which are about organizing new green areas in the city, 30% of voters voted for building new playgrounds, and 40% of voters voted for projects which are about building new infrastructure for bikes. Again, if we use the greedy rule, then only the projects which received the highest number of votes would be selected. In this case, this means that we would select only those projects which are about building new infrastructure for bikes. This would be unfair. The votes of about 60% of the population of voters would be completely ignored. This effect in the literature is called the tyranny of majority. I think that in this case it is more appropriate to call this effect the tyranny of the largest minority. Indeed, one can argue that 40% of voters is a large enough number to allow those voters to decide about the whole city budget. Yet we can make this example even more striking. In this second example, there are 6 groups of projects, and now we can see that only 18% of voters can decide about the whole budget. The votes of 82% of voters are completely ignored. And how does it look in practice? For example, in Krakow, in 2020, if there were a group of 8% of the voters, and if such a group made a deal to vote on similar set of projects, they could be able to decide how the whole city budget is spent. This is, on the one hand, unfair, and on the other hand, this is very dangerous. If such a small number of voters can decide about such a large amount of money, then it becomes profitable for the project owners to put pressure on such voters, and the voters now can have also an incentive to make deals with each other with respect to how to vote. We would rather to have a proportional rule. A rule that would, only by looking at the preferences of the voters, could make such a decision that each group of voters with similar preferences would be represented proportionally to its size in the outcome returned by the rule. As we have seen, the greedy rule can discriminate certain groups of voters, and now the question arises, does it happen in practice? This is the list of groups discriminated in an election that was held in Częstochowa in 2020. How can we read this table? For example, have a look at the first row. A group of roughly 3.5% of voters voted for the project of help for stray animals. According to the idea of proportionality, those voters shall be able to decide about roughly 3.5% of the whole budget. The project cost only 1.8% of the whole budget. This means that according to the principle of proportionality, those voters should be able to decide about this project, to make it funded. This project was not selected, and what is more, none of the voters who voted for this project approved any other project that was funded. So these voters in principle were completely ignored. Even though, according to the principle of proportionality, they should be able to decide about two projects of a similar size. These are examples of discriminated groups of voters from other cities. And here are some quantitative metrics. For example, we can see that in Zabrze in 2020 there were more than 10% of voters who belonged to some discriminated groups. There were lots of such groups as well. For example, in Warsaw in 2020 there were more than 50 such groups. One can ask, is it a lot? Note that here we are counting only the voters who got nothing. We do not even count the voters who, according to the principle of proportionality, shall be able to decide about certain amount of funds, but in fact, in reality, they decided about a smaller amount. We are only counting the voters which were completely ignored in the process of decision making. 10% of such voters is really a lot. So far I discussed the greedy rule and I explained some problems that appear when using this rule to make final decisions about which projects to fund. To sum up, this rule is not proportional, which means that it does not treat voters equally. And some tricks that we can apply to make it more proportional, for example, division of the budget a priori between the districts, causes some other problems. For example, it makes money being spent inefficiently. In the remaining part of this talk, I will discuss an alternative election rule, which is called the method of equal shares, which does not have these problems that appear with the greedy rule. According to the method of equal shares, the budget is first divided equally among the voters, and selecting projects resembles the process of buying these projects by the candidates. I will explain the definition and illustrate this definition on simple examples later on, but first let me show some simulations which illustrate how the outcomes in Polish participatory budgeting elections would change if we used the method of equal shares instead of the greedy method. Let's first have a look how the satisfaction of the voters would change if we used the method of equal shares instead of the greed method. But how to measure a satisfaction of a voter? One of the most natural ways is to define it as the number of projects that the voter voted for and that were selected. This table compares the average satisfaction of the voters from the outcomes returned by the greedy rule and by method of equal shares. For example, we can see that in Częstochowa, if we use the greedy method, as it is done today, then the average satisfaction of the voters would equal 1. This means that those voters, on average, would approve one from the selected projects. At the same time, if we use the method of equal shares, then the average satisfaction of the voters would be significantly higher. It would equal 1.5. Not only the satisfaction of the voters, the average satisfaction of the voters would be higher, but also the satisfaction would be more evenly distributed. In particular, there would be 49% of the voters which would be more happy from the outcomes returned by the method of equal shares than from the outcomes that were returned by the greedy rule. Only 14% of the voters would be less happy. And these results are consistent. In each city, we see that the average satisfaction of the voters would be higher and that this satisfaction would be more evenly distributed among the voters. what would happen if we define the satisfaction of the voters differently? For example, in these cities that use voting in scale, it makes sense to define the satisfaction of a voter as the number of points that this voter assigned to those projects that were selected. If we define satisfaction this way, then our conclusions still hold. We can see that the satisfaction of the voters from the outcomes returned by the greedy rule is on average lower than from the outcomes returned by the method of equal shares. Similarly, there are more voters who prefer the outcomes returned by the method of equal shares to the outcomes returned by the greedy method than the other way around. In the cities where approval voting is used, it also makes sense to define the satisfaction of a voter as the amount of money spent on those projects that were selected. Here also we can see that the average satisfaction of the voters is higher if we use the method of equal shares instead in comparison to the case if we use the greedy method. And also this satisfaction is more evenly distributed among the voters. This data analysis is supported with the theoretical results. It has been shown that the method of equal shares satisfies very strong properties that pertain to proportionality. This is important because it shows that what we have seen in data is not a coincidence. It has been shown that no matter how the voters would vote, the outcomes returned by the method of equal shares will be proportional. One implication of this result is that there will be no discriminated groups of voters. The groups that we have seen plenty of in the outcomes returned by the greedy rule. Yet another implication of this result is that the method of equal shares can be viewed as an extension of the D'Hondt method of apportionment. The D'Hondt method is used by many countries to elect parliaments. So this result is also important because it shows that we are not speaking about some exotic idea of proportionality. We are speaking about some idea that appears in the literature and in practice for many years, and the method of equal shares only extends this idea to the more complex setting of participatory budgeting. The method of equal shares is well defined for approval voting and for voting in scale. This means that we can count any of these two types of ballots using this method. I will now explain the definition of the method of equal shares, and I will start with approval voting, since this is the simpler case. I will explain this definition through the following example. In this example we have 8 projects, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Each of these projects costs 200 euros. The available budget is 1000 euros, which means that we can afford to select 5 out of these 8 projects. There are 100 voters. The first 20 voters voted for projects from A to F. The next 26 voters voted for projects A, B, C, D, E. The next 11 voters voted for projects D and G, and so on. In the first step of the method of equal shares, the budget is divided equally among the voters. The budget is 1000 euros, there are 100 voters, so this means that each voter gets 10 euros. In the next steps, for each project, we do the following calculation. We try to distribute its cost among the voters who voted for this project. For example, let's have a look at project D. There were 66 voters who approved this project. The cost of this project is 200. So this means that if we distribute it equally among the voters, that each of them would need to pay roughly 3 euros for this project, if it were selected. On the other hand, if we selected project A, that was approved by 60 voters, then each voter would need to pay 3.3 euros for this project. Similarly, for project C, if we divided its cost among the voters who voted for this project, then each of them would need to pay 3.64 euros. So we pick among those projects the one for which the maximal payment of a voter divided by the cost of the project is minimal. In this case, this is project D. Here the maximal payment, 3 euros, divided by the cost, 200, is the lowest among the available projects. The intuition behind this calculation is the following. The voters would like to have as much money spent on the project that they voted for as possible, but at the same time they would like to pay for that as little as possible. So project D is selected in the first round. In the second round we proceed as before. We select the project for which the maximal payment of a voter divided by the cost of the project would be minimal. In this case, this means that we will select project A. In the next step, we will select project C. And in the next step, we will select project G. And now have a look at the calculation that was done here for project G. If we divided the cost of project G equally among the supporters of G, this means that some voters, namely those from the fourth group, would need to pay too much. That is, they would need to exceed their initial budget of 10 euros. This means that we cannot divide this cost of G equally among those voters, but we need to do it as equally as possible so that none of the voters would exceed its initial endowment. In this case, this means that the voters from the fourth group would need to pay 3.33 euros. The voters from the last group would need to pay 6.67, and the voters from the third group would pay 6.97. So the maximal payment of a voter here would be 6.97. We divide it by the cost of the project, that is by 200, and this value is minimal for project G among all the other projects. So this is why G is selected in the fourth round. In the last round, we select project H, and here observe that, for example, there exist other projects which received higher number of votes. For example, project E received 46 votes, while project H received only 20 votes. But still, those voters who voted for project E, they already used their money, their voting power to select other projects, so they are already happy. While the voters who voted for project H, they still have unused money, and they form such a group that allows them to select the project H. And this is why project H is selected in the last step. In this step, the rule finishes, which means that it selects project A, C, D, G, and H. This is the definition of the method of equal shares for approvals. Admittedly, it's more complex than the definition of the greedy rule, yet what is important, we can still fit it in one slide. Actually, I would like to argue that the definition of the method of equal shares is even simpler than the definition of the greedy method as it is used today. This is because very often cities apply certain tricks to solve problems with the greedy method. As I argued before, this does not really solve the problems with the greedy method, and at the same time makes the definition of the greedy method more complex. For example, it's not transparent for the voters how exactly the budget is divided between districts. Some cities also divide the budget a priori between different categories. For example, in Wrocław, a certain part of the budget is designated to projects that relate to culture. How this division of the budget between the cultural projects and the other types of projects is implemented is very often not clear for the voters. So in fact, the greedy rule, with all its tricks, sometimes is more complex than the method of equal shares, which can be just described in one slide. Let me now explain the definition of the method of equal shares for the case of voting in scale. Let me recall that when the voters vote in scale, this means that each voter assigns a certain number of points to each project, quantifying her satisfaction from the project. Let me illustrate this definition through the following example. Here once again we have 8 projects, but the projects now have different costs. For example, project A costs 120 euros, project B costs 200 euros, and so on and so forth. The total available budget is 2,500 euros. There are 250 voters, and each voter was asked to assign between 0 and 100 points to each project. For example, the first 65 voters assigned 30 points to project B and 10 points to projects E and G and 0 points to the other projects. The next 35 voters assigned 30 points to projects B and C and 10 points to project G, and so on and so forth. The first step of the method of equal shares is exactly the same as in the case of approvals. We distribute the available budget equally among the voters. The budget is 2,500. There are 250 voters. This means that each voter gets 10 euros. In the next steps, we iterate over the projects, and for each project we ask, how shall we distribute its cost among the voters? And we try to distribute it in such a way that each voter gets the same number of points of satisfaction per euro spent. For project B, this means that the cost should be distributed equally among those voters that assigned positive utility to this project. Indeed, in such a case, the voters would pay 2 euros and each of them would get 30 points of satisfaction per these 2 euros, which means 15 points of satisfaction per 1 euro. How this would work for project G? Project G got in total from all the voters 10,000 points. It costs 1,000 euro. And actually, it is possible to distribute the cost of project G between the voters in such a way that each voter would get 10 points of satisfaction per 1 euro. Such a distribution of the cost of G is depicted in this diagram. For example, the voters from the first group, each of them should pay 1 euro, and in return they would get 10 points of satisfaction. The voters from the third group would need to pay 4 euros, getting in return 30 points of satisfaction, 40 points of satisfaction, that is 10 points of satisfaction per 1 euro spent, and so on and so forth. And now the rule first selects such a project that results in the highest number of points of satisfaction per euro spent. In this case, this means that project B would be selected first with 15 points of satisfaction per 1 euro. Project G would be selected second with 10 points of satisfaction per 1 euro. Next, we would select project F with 5 points of satisfaction per 1 euro. And in the fourth round, we would select project E. And now we can see that similarly as in the case of approvals, here we cannot distribute the cost of project E as we would like to. That is, in a way that each voter would get the same number of points of satisfaction per euro. Why this is the case? Because some voters already run out of money, and if we distributed the cost of E in such a way, then those voters would need to exceed their initial endowment of 10 euros. In such a case, similarly as in the case of approvals, we try to distribute this cost of E as fairly as possible. In other words, in such a way that if we take the worst voter, then for this worst voter, the number of points of satisfaction per 1 euro is the highest. In this case, this means that the voters from the first group shall pay 5.54 euros, and in return they will get 10 points of satisfaction, and the voters from the third group, they would pay all the money that they have, 4 euros, and get 30 points of satisfaction in return. Here the worst voters are those from the first group, and they get 2 points of satisfaction, roughly 2 points of satisfaction per 1 euro. And among the not selected yet projects, these 2 points of satisfaction per 1 euro is the highest for project E. And this is why project E is selected in this round. In the next round, we select project C, and the rule finishes. It returns projects B, C, E, F, and G. Note that the available funds would allow us to select one additional project, either A or H. However, the method of equal shares would not select either of them. Why this is the case? This is because the voters who assigned positive points to either of these two projects, they do not have enough funds to make a purchase. This shows that, in principle, the outcome returned by the method of equal shares might not be exhaustive. That is, the total cost of those projects that were selected might not exhaust the available funds. We can still have some money that would allow us, in principle, to feed one or a few additional projects. If we are interested in a method that is exhaustive, then there are certain techniques that would allow us to make method of equal shares exhaustive, and I will describe these techniques a little bit later on. So this is the precise definition of the method of equal shares for the case of voting in scale. So I do not want you to look exactly at these formulas, but what I would like to emphasize is that this definition fits one slide. These formulas are very precise, they do not allow for any kind of ambiguity, so in principle this definition is very transparent and easy to check by the voters. And this definition also comes from the scientific publications. So this means that these formulas were checked, reviewed and accepted by the scientific community. Finally, there are different variants of the method of equal shares. However, what is important is that all these variants share good properties pertaining to proportionality and efficiency of spending public money. For example, if the voters vote via approvals, then there are different ways in which we can define the satisfaction of a voter. Perhaps the most natural way is to define a satisfaction of a voter as the total amount of money spent on the projects that the voter voted for. And this results in a definition that I was referring to during this presentation. In particular, the definition of the method of equal shares for approvals that I was presenting in previous slides is exactly the definition that uses this underlying assumption. However, in principle, we could also define the satisfaction of a voter slightly differently. For example, as the number of projects that the voter voted for and that were selected. This would result in a slightly different behavior of the rule. In particular, this would make the rule select a greater quantity but smaller projects. This is important that these different variants exist, because now the authority that faces the problem of selecting the right rule has some flexibility. The authority can select either of these two variants depending on its strategy. Whether they would be interested in selecting fewer but larger projects or a greater number of smaller projects. Similarly, there are different ways in which we can complete the outcome return by the method of equal shares to make it exhaustive. We recommend the following variant. So we run the method of equal shares and we check the cost of the selected projects. If this total cost is lower than the available funds, then we slightly increase the initial endowment of the voters. That is, we give them slightly more money. And then we run the method of equal shares once again. And we repeat this procedure until the moment when the next increase of the initial endowment would result in exceeding the total available funds. As I have mentioned before, the method of equal shares is described in scientific publications, but there are also some other sources where you could find some additional information about this method. In particular, it's described in Wikipedia. Let me now conclude by showing a concrete example that illustrates the difference between the method of equal shares and the greedy method. That is the method that is currently used by most of the cities. This example comes from Warsaw from 2020. I am aware that here the font is very small and that the names of the projects are in Polish, so I do not want you to read this slide carefully, but I will tell you the most important differences. So the two rules would select some of these projects selected by these two rules would be the same. One such project would be new bike paths. So this is a very expensive project. It costs more than 4 million Polish zlotys, but it also receives high support, that is over 30,000 votes. And this project will be selected by both rules. Now have a look at the difference between these two rules. Let's start with the greedy method. So the greedy method would additionally select these two projects. These are also very expensive projects, and what is important, they are also about new infrastructure for bikes. So we can see that the greedy method overrepresents some group of voters. The method of equal shares, on the other hand, by looking at the preferences of the voters, could identify that these voters were already happy because they were already able to decide about certain amount of funds, and it will not overrepresent them by funding these 2 additional projects. Instead, it will fund this list of projects. What is important is that it will not select 2 projects that in total received 30,000 votes, and instead it will be able to select projects that in total received over 200,000 votes. So we can see that the difference is really striking. So in summary, the greedy rule, that is the rule that is currently used by most cities, is not proportional. It treats some groups of voters unequally. The cities try to apply certain tricks. For example, one such a trick is to divide the budget a priori between the districts. This does not really solve the problem, and what is worse, this causes some additional problems that pertain to inefficiency of using public money. The method of equal shares is a much better alternative. It is proportional, and it doesn't really require applying certain tricks. It doesn't require dividing the budget a priori between the districts. So maybe instead of using an inefficient and not proportional rule for selecting projects in participatory budgeting elections, we shall vote for changing the election rule used for counting ballots.